Good evening, everyone. Good to see you. That's right. There's some energy. My name is Carrie Ann O'Meara, and I am provost here at Teachers College. And I am so excited to welcome you here to this lecture, the 10th annual Edmund W. Gordon Lecture. As one of 3 distinguished lectures of the college, this lecture honors a distinguished emeritus member of our community and scholarly leader of education and social justice, Professor Edmund W. Gordon, who is the John W. Musser Professor of Psychology Emeritus at Yale University and Richard March Ho Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Education, that's a mouthful, at Teachers College. And I'd just like to acknowledge that Professor Gordon isn't here with us right now, but is able to stream in, and so is listening very much to this lecture. And I'm very excited to be in your presence, Professor Gordon. So the Gordon Lecture provides us this great opportunity every year to reflect on Professor Gordon's legacy broadly in higher education and beyond, but also as a leader, a doer, and a visionary at Teachers College. One of the things I've been so impressed about at TC and learning about the history here has been the way in which TC's history is always responsiveness to what's happening in the world and the challenges of the time, and the willingness of TC leaders, scholars, faculty, students to go first into those spaces. Whether that going first means creating a new field, to forge a new partnership, to serve a group of students or community members who've been marginalized. Professor Gordon's legacy of work so much falls into this legacy that I've just discussed of responsiveness to the world as well as going first. So Professor Gordon completed his doctorate at TC in 1957. His dissertation was entitled "Toward Meeting the Mental Health Needs of Underprivileged Minority Group Children in the Harlem Community of New York City." In 1973, Professor Gordon founded the Institute for Urban and Minority Education, sponsored jointly by Teachers College and Educational Testing Service, ETS. And the mission was to specialize in research, development, training, and service programs designed to improve education in the nation's cities. IUME was founded to put research to action in the service of urban education. And as you all know well, Professor Gordon and his colleagues at IUME have done so much important work over the last 50 years, foundational work on Head Start, in-service training materials for desegregation, public education materials for radio and TV, case studies of unique efforts of compensatory education and desegregation. And there are so many amazing things to say about Professor Gordon's many impacts throughout his career and continuing to today. In July 2019, actually, Professor Gordon was honored in front of a standing room only audience at TC. A portrait of Dr. Gordon was formally unveiled for permanent display at the college. A laboratory school in Brooklyn was named in his honor in 2021. You know, in addition to all of these observations, I would observe that what struck me in attending the 50th anniversary event at AERA were all of the former students, now colleagues, who said at many anniversary events that being part of the IUME community and in his orbit and sponsorship had changed their lives for good. And I can't think of anything better to say than that kind of a legacy. This year at TC, we're having a set of dialogues to consider the commitments we want to make toward moving forward with our students, our scholarship, our partnership work, and each other as part of the TC community. During our session on scholarship, faculty observed that they wanted to create space for the undiscovered, providing cover as scholars imagine new fields, take risks, develop new methods of study and discovery, emerge first. That we want to expand access to knowledge produced at DC, opening windows and doors, curating exchange, organizing for impact on the pressing issues of the day, and bringing students into the academy through our scholarship. Do any of those themes sound familiar? I think they do, right? And as so many parts of TC's history, where our history is our history, but it's also our future, you hear so many of those themes in the legacy of the work, past, present, and future of Gordon and IUME. So I am so excited that under the leadership of Professor Ezekiel Dixon-Roman, Professor of Critical Race, Media, and Educational Studies, who's joining us via Zoom and be introducing our speaker in a moment. That IUME, that the Gordon Institute and IUME continue to innovate, including such areas as the REACH program, of course, but also reducing school gun violence among the faculty, racial literacies, creating the first Black Studies curriculum for New York City public schools, and the cultural studies of hip hop and STEAM education, among so many other exciting initiatives. The Gordon Lecture was created in 2013 to, of course, bring folks together to discuss the most pressing issues of the day through cutting edge and critical research from our country's top education leaders. And so tonight, we continue that proud legacy of research, action, and community. Over the years, we've heard from such luminaries as Professors Charles Payne, Professor Sonia Nieto, Professor Erica Walker, our own Professor Erica Walker, Professor Gloria Ladson-Billings, and our own Professor Dixon-Roman, speaking on racial logics threaded into AI. I am so very excited to hear from our distinguished speaker tonight, Dr. Fred Moten, as we strive to understand and push the boundaries in what we can know and do together. And at this time, I will turn the podium over to the director, who will introduce our speaker. So Professor Ezekiel Dixon-Roman, I introduce you now. Hopefully you can join us to do the introduction.
Very, very bummed that I'm not able to be physically present with you all due to COVID. I'm very appreciative of my IUME team, TCIT, TC Generation, and all of those who put in significant effort in organizing this event. I'd like to begin by recognizing that we gather on the traditional lands of the Lenape people. As stewards of the land, they lived alongside and with the givings of the Hudson River, the Delaware River, and the Atlantic Ocean and the land in between. May we respectfully acknowledge all indigenous people that lived and became subject to the violent hands of settler colonialism, those living and surviving despite the ongoing and continued horror of state-sponsored violence and dispossession, and to those who dare to imagine another world, and may we work toward that alternative worlding with them. I also must acknowledge the massive and devastating loss of life in the Middle East, both Israeli and Palestinian. What is being witnessed on the global political stage through AI-powered warfare is calculated genocide. I contribute to the already reverberating voices calling for not just ceasefire and peace, but the right to self-determination. As Provost O'Meary spoke to, this lecture is part of the series of events and activities that is in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Edmund W. Gordon Institute for Urban and Minority Education. I'd like to extend appreciation to the college for their support of this annual distinguished lecture. I would also like to thank the Black Education Research Center, the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, and the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department for each of their support. It was just 10 months ago that I was sitting on the front row about to deliver the distinguished Sachs and Gordon lectures. After, as I thought about who would be the first Gordon lecturer under my directorship, who would fit the new directions of the Institute, and who would be appropriate for the 10th annual lecturer during the 50th anniversary of the Institute. Unequivocally, the scholar, thinker, and intellectual that came to mind was Dr. Fred Moten. Fred Moten is a renowned and distinguished poet, scholar, and cultural theorist whose work engages critical theory, Black studies, and performance studies. Moten's scholarship is characterized by its interdisciplinary approach, blending insights from literature, philosophy, and Black studies. One of his central contributions lies in his exploration of the relationship between aesthetics and politics, particularly in the context of Black culture and experience. Moten's influential concepts such as Blackness, the undercommons, fugitivity, debt, and para-ontology, among others, challenged conventional notions and offered new ways of understanding the dynamics of power, colonialism, resistance, and community. His work often engages with the works of other influential figures such as Frantz Fanon and Jacques Derrida. further enriching the intellectual landscape of contemporary academic discourse. Moten critically traverses these thinkers to not only examine the forces of racial violence and subjugation of racial capitalism, but he is deeply interested in the performances, the improvisations, or what longtime interlocutor Saidiya Hartman has characterized as the wayward of Black lives. His work has had a profound impact on the study of race, culture, performance, and Black studies, pushing the boundaries of conventional academic disciplines and inspiring new avenues of thought. Dr. Moten is professor and associate chair of performance studies and professor of comparative literature at New York University, and distinguished professor emeritus at the University of California, Irvine. An award-winning poet, he is the author of at least 9 creative works, including B. Jenkins, a poetic and theoretical exploration named after his late mother that intertwines themes of Black culture, music, and philosophy. He is the recipient of the United States Artist Rockefeller Fellowship, the Roy Lichtenstein Award from the Foundation for Contemporary Arts, the Stephen E. Henderson Award for Outstanding Achievement in Poetry, African American Literature, and Culture Society. Alum of Harvard University and the University of California, Berkeley, where he took his PhD, he has gone on to become a prolific scholar, authoring at least 8 academic books. He is a 2020 MacArthur Fellow, a Truman Capote Awardee for Literary Criticism in memory of Newton Arvin, and a 2016 Guggenheim Fellow. From In the Break to All Incomplete, Moten has pushed us to think unconventionally, to interrogate modernity, to tear down the project of the human, to be unfaithful and criminal to the institution. For instance, In the Break has become one of the prominent texts and required reads of the Black radical tradition. It provides a vocabulary and understanding in and through his poetic theorizations and descriptions of Blackness, of the excess and resistance to the static and transparent subjectivities that are so often assumed to be uniform and which dominate the West and animate its violences. In the Break's centering and study of the sonic solidifies that there is always an outside to and of recording, and that this artifact of performance bears solely the trace of the very performance it claims to represent. His work is always a treasure trove of theoretical interventions, ideas, poetic prose, and quotes. In the Break is no exception, with quotes such as, "The history of Blackness is testament to the fact that objects can and do resist." Perhaps more important than his intellectual contributions are his relational ones, to the extent that the two can be separated. The undercommons, like for so many others, again, provided a vocabulary for the practices and ways of reading, conversing, and being together in the classroom, within institutions, and in space generally. Study, its practice in or perhaps underneath the university and outside of it, is what brings so many of us together to these professions. This is a practice forged by a particular attraction to particular texts and particular ways of reading texts, with a close read of the sociopolitical, culture, and aesthetic that enrich our sensations and invigorate our movements. As he and longtime collaborator and friend Stefano Hardy state, the only possible relationship to the university today is a criminal one. This evening, we have the privilege to host Dr. Moten as this year's 10th annual Distinguished Gordon Lecturer on a topic that has long been of intellectual interest to Edmund W. Gordon. In a 2021 book chapter, Professor Gordon states that, quote, "It is impossible to understand without first having knowledge, but knowledge is of limited value without understanding its context, meanings, and consequences." This evening, we shall learn from Professor Moten's Notes on the Understanding. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Fred Moten.
Thank you so much, Professor Dick. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm hoping that I don't cause any great technological disasters while I'm up here, but I usually do. So, but there's a first time for everything. I really want to thank Professor Dixon Roman for very kind and generous, overly generous introduction. I want to thank Veronica and Brianna, all the people who made it possible for me to be here today. I want to especially thank Dr. Celie Ruiz, and I'm really looking forward to us having a chance to talk. So I'm gonna try to get this over with as quickly as possible so we can do that. And above all, obviously, and I guess I'm sort of foreshadowing what I'm about to say, we all owe such a great debt of gratitude to Professor Gordon, and I'm really honored to be here to try to not just speak to and about the intensity and the great generosity and great path-breaking force of his work, but also to see if it's possible maybe to even just add a little bit to it. So I found myself over the last few years in a kind of a conundrum. It's got multiple elements to it. About 8 or 9 years ago, it got to the point where it just felt really hard to stand in front of people and read something. You know, I started to feel like maybe the better thing would be to circulate stuff beforehand, but that's tough because usually, as in the case of today, I'm in the middle of thinking about stuff, so it was about 3:30 when I reluctantly left my computer preparing notes for this. And I want you to know that it's a great leap of faith for me to say that, because I don't want you to think that I hadn't been thinking about it and preparing for it. It's just that I couldn't stop thinking about it and preparing for it. And then that raises the real question, and I think it is a question. And I think it very much has to do with this problem of understanding and of the understanding. What does it mean to have to stop thinking about something in order to present your thoughts on something? Like why do we accept such a condition in the first place? Okay. I wanted to. So that's part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is that, you know, I start writing, and I write these notes, and well, there's a great trumpeter, extraordinary musician and composer named Wadada Leo Smith. And once I heard him talking about improvising, and especially his solo improvisations, and he said, people don't really understand how bad it hurts to play this music. Okay. And I don't want to say that it hurts to write in that same way that he was describing, but it's a complicated feeling. It's a deep feeling because it's really about being in the midst of this thinking, and it's really, especially with regard to the Black experience. And I'm very happy to use that phrase because I feel over the course of the last 20 years, it's a phrase that has kind of fallen on hard times, as if somehow it couldn't bear the complexity that it bears, so we needed some other term, right? But it turns out that it can bear all the complexity and richness that we could imagine. And I feel much better about using that term because in Dr. Gordon's recent writings, he uses it. So if he does it, it must be okay. And but with regard to the Black experience, which is such a complicated amalgam of joy and pain, as Frankie Beverly used to say, and as Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock repeated, right? But it's not because it's 50% joy and 50% pain. It's because it's 100% joy and 100% pain. And the joy and the pain are inseparable, which means that you're already dealing with something that goes outside the framework of a normative mathematics. This is a problematic of the incalculable. And I'll try to come back to that in a minute too. But it's hard to write, or to try to write, not so much about the incalculable, but in and with the incalculable, right? I think we imagine that writing about the incalculable might be a little bit easier, and so we try to take that stance up towards it, as if separating ourselves or distancing ourselves from this incalculable difficulty within which we write could make it easier to write about it. It's just that it makes it impossible to write about it precisely insofar as it does make it easy. Because we don't do nothing easy. It's got to be rough, as the late, great Tina Turner used to say. So this roughness, this corrosiveness, this thing that we do that rubs us, and often rubs us the wrong way. It takes a lot out of you to try to do it, you know. And you end up having to come up with all kinds of complicated ways of doing it. In a way, I think it's a lot like physics. The language, the ordinary language that is given for such a pursuit, let's say especially within the realm of scholarship, just doesn't quite work. And so you need something like jargon. Not the jargon that the New York Times likes to vilify every couple of years when they write one stupid, boring article, you know, on this or that thinker who they're mad about not being able to understand, right? I don't have a beef with that kind of jargon. It's just that it's not so much that kind of jargon as it is what Frederick Douglass refers to as the unmeaning jargon that animates the songs that the enslaved people sang. Okay? So this question of meaning and this whole problematic of non-meaning or of unmeaning, that's also something that I want to see if I can try to get to today. And then we're always trying to get to it. And it's complicated to be always trying to get to something that you're also always in, right? Okay. So we're trying to get to this thing that we're in. It puts you in a certain amount of difficulty. And the language becomes complicated, it becomes thick, or sometimes maybe too thin. Sometimes words, just as my old friend and teacher Nathaniel Mackey says, quoting the great saxophonist Charles Lloyd, sometimes words don't go there. Sometimes words go beyond there. Sometimes words can't do what can do, or where, you know, right? So we, you know, and it's complicated too, because how can you get that down on paper? How can you type that into a computer? And what I'm trying to say is that the condition that it has produced for me over the course of the last few years especially is that the more I think I finally got something that seems to be approaching what it is I'm trying to say, the more likely it is that no one else will know what I'm talking about. It's a strange phenomenon. And so it has produced for me this kind of complicated performance anxiety, I guess you could say. But I'm trying to, you know, deal with the anxiety by changing my performative protocols. So I got some stuff that I want to read, and I'm gonna try my best to read it. And I'm gonna assume that no one in here knows what I'm talking about. including me. and then I'm going to try to say what it is that I was trying to talk about. So in a way, I guess what I'm doing is something, one of my favorite poets, a great poet from New Jersey, which is the epicenter of American poetry, William Carlos Williams. He wrote a book once called I Wanted to Write a Poem, and it's a kind of anthology of his work in which he prints the poem and then tries to talk about the poem that he wrote, right? And I'm going to try to do something like that, even if what I'm using here is not necessarily poetry. So that's one part of what I want to do. And then the part that I don't quite have worked out yet, and I got these notes and stuff, so if anybody wants them, you can email me and I'll send them to you. But so I don't think I've ever really been a scholar. Like one time I had this friend who told me that I wasn't a scholar. We were driving to a conference together and he's like, well, you're not really a scholar, man. And I decided to not let my little feelings get hurt because it was unclear to me if that was whatever I was trying to be, right? But I think maybe a much closer thing, I don't know if I'm closer to this than being a scholar, but I'm much closer to wanting to be this than a scholar, is I want to be a DJ. DJ. My mom, who we're going to talk about today, she played piano a little bit, but her true instrument and the greatness of her musicality was that she played the turntables. She was an extraordinary DJ. Not in that sense that we might think of in terms of going to the club, but more like she played the right records that would both correspond to and also create the social situation. Okay. So the part of this talk that is kind of freaking me out a little bit is there's some music that I want to play. And then there's another part, which is mostly what I do is read and write. I read a lot, but I don't read a lot of books. I read a few things a lot. I obsessively reread 4 or 5 things, okay? And it makes it difficult to write articles because most of the time the journals want you to condense the quotations. For some reason, they seem to think that some of it has to do with copyright, I imagine, but some of it's like a style thing. They don't like long quotations, but I like to just sink into the quotations, you know. And so I got these long quotations that I want to read to y'all today, but they're too long for the time frame that we have. So I got to figure that part out on the fly. But I'm gonna trust you to keep me in line. And so that's the other part of this preface, okay, which is, I know we'll have time for questions and answers at the end, but there's really no reason for questions and answers to come last. So you have to help me. If I say something is totally incomprehensible in any way, if you would do me the favor of saying, wait, what? That will help me tremendously, okay? Because the problem, it's not that I have something to say that you don't understand. I don't think I have anything to say that you don't already know. I just want you to recognize it, right? Okay. Okay, so we were gonna do this thing where I was gonna take my computer, which I made a playlist for today, and I'm gonna take it over here in a minute, but I think what I'm gonna do is there's a poem that I wanted to read to you, but instead of doing it that way, I'm gonna read it myself, rather than what I had done originally was I found a YouTube version of the poet who actually wrote it, who was reading it, but I'm gonna read it myself. So the poem is called "Often I Am Permitted to Return to a Meadow," and it's by a great poet, Robert Duncan. So maybe this is like my epigraph. Often I am permitted to return to a meadow, as if it were a scene made up by the mind that is not mine, but is a made place that is mine. It is so near to the heart, an eternal pasture folded in all thought, so that there is a hall therein that is a made place, created by light, wherefrom the shadows that are forms fall, wherefrom fall all architectures I am. I say are likenesses of the first beloved, whose flowers are flames lit to the lady. She, it is queen under the hill, whose hosts are a disturbance of words within words, that is a field folded. It is only a dream of the grass blowing east against the source of the sun in an hour before the sun's going down, whose secret we see in a children's game of ring a round of roses told. Often I am permitted to return to a meadow as if it were a given property of the mind that certain bounds hold against chaos, that is a place of first permission, everlasting omen of what is. That poem was written sometime between 1956 and 1959 in a book that Duncan published in 1960 called The Opening of the Field. Okay. So I'm a student of Nathaniel Mackey, who was a student of Robert Duncan, and I am marked by that and held by that. This is the condition that sparks, but also structures my gratitude this evening. I'm thankful to be here, and I want to tell you why. I have been very happily reading and listening to Edmund Gordon over the past few days and weeks, and I am beginning to formulate what I hope are some good questions regarding the distinction he makes between the production of knowledge and the pursuit of understanding. He prepares a field in the way that it can be said that a table is prepared, in a way that neither cultivation nor protection captures, but to which improvision makes reminiscent, experiential, experimental, and radically sensual, which is to say, empirical approach. Okay, so that's the first sentence where I went off a little bit. So but I want y'all to come with me, okay? So I made up a word, improvision. Okay, so all I did was I put I am in parentheses before provision. Provision, right? Make provision. Y'all know what that is, right? I said it improvision because I didn't want to say cultivate. I'm thinking also of the way in which people in the Caribbean talk about ground provisions, right? The ways in which people have of having a kind of attunement to the land that lets them know what there is that's on the ground and in the ground already prior to their cultivation of it that can be part of their sustenance. Okay. And provision, if you think about it etymologically, it says what you think it says. Vision, seeing, look ahead, right? As in proceed, right? It's a looking forward. So to make provision for somebody, to make provision for yourself or for your family is is to do the work that will, you hope, help to sustain them through the future. Okay. When I say improvision, however, I'm trying to do something that's a little tricky and a little weird. And it's connected up to those words, to the word reminiscent that I used. Okay. And this is, I think, something that animates Dr. Gordon's work, like all throughout, all the stuff that I've read. So think about it this way, like, how do I begin? Okay. One way to think about improvision is that it is a word that has a certain romantic relationship, let's say, to improvisation. Okay. Visare, right? That's the Latin root. It means, again, vision or to see. Provisare, to look ahead. Okay. And you know, the kind of folks who look ahead are the rational ones, the ones who think, the ones who can think independently or against the grain of their own impulses and their own desires, right? They put something away for the future. They don't just do what it is that might gratify them at the moment. In other words, the ones who look ahead, the ones who provide, right, are generally understood also to be the ones who we could say are rational and even mature. They have achieved a certain majority. Of course, you do know historically that most of us who are in this room have been racialized or gendered in such a way as to disqualify us from that condition, right? We are not the ones who look ahead. We are not the ones who plan. We are not the ones who can take care of ourselves and anybody. This is what they say, you know, okay? It's one of the reasons why my grandfather, Charlie Jenkins, took such extraordinary pride, right, in being a good provider. It wasn't just that he wanted to give the lie to the assumption that he could not look ahead and plan. He also wanted to go against the grain of the material conditions that were set in place so that he would not be able to, right? Because this is, you know, one of the ways in which certain, you know, normative theories of white superiority work. They theorize, they assume black inferiority, and then they create conditions which are supposed to absolutely make it clear and sure, right? Sartre calls it bad faith. Okay. So one way to think about what I'm trying to say is that the history of the discourse on improvisation, right, which is a fundamental element in Afro-diasporic music of every kind, that discourse is always meant to suggest that this is this sort of unpremeditated art, to use Shelley's phrase, right? Y'all know that? Percy Shelley wrote a poem called The Skylark, in which he praises the skylark for producing profuse strains of unpremeditated art. And it's cool that skylarks can do that, right? But we're something other than skylarks, right? We're like Aretha Franklin singing Skylark, right? At which point you see, nah, there's some premeditation in this, right? Or at least something that seems like that. There's some planning here. There's some thinking involved. But what if there's a kind of truth about this thing, about this tendency, let's say, that we say not to look ahead? Okay. What if it turns out that improvisation, right, and M is a prefix that negates provision, so not looking ahead. What if it turns out that improvisation, that the reason people aren't looking ahead, the reason why we could say that Miles or Train or, you know, Mary Lou Williams weren't looking ahead in the performance of the music is because they were looking back, right? They play with historical and critical consciousness, right? When Miles plays So What, April 3rd, 1964 in Chicago, part of what he was thinking about when he was playing was the performance he gave on March 12th, 1964 in Philadelphia. And he was making a critical commentary not only on his prior performance, but also on a whole range of other performances that led to that performance. You see? So it's a historical, critical consciousness. In this respect, we're like Walter Benjamin's Angel of History. We move forward while we're looking backward. Okay. So when I say improvision, that's what I mean. Right? My grandfather was moving forward, but part of why he was moving forward, part of the way in which he organized his efforts to provide for his family was that he was always aware of a history which tended to militate against that capacity to provide, right? Okay. Okay, so first of all, I see now that we are in a huge dilemma, because I'm supposed to end at 6? Okay, so, and I only got through 3 sentences, so, but let me read the sentence again, right? Okay. He prepares a field, right? And see, I'm saying field because I'm like, y'all with me. I know y'all are with me, right? You're like field, as in field Negro field. You know, but also the opening of the field in that way that Duncan writes, and he means it in a he means field theory. He's talking about, you know, physics in the wake of the 19th century innovations and theoretical advances of people like, you know, Faraday, right? Field theory was this kind of theory where you sort of said, man, here's a magnet and here's some steel. And when I put the magnet in relation to the steel, something seems to be going on in there, even though there's nothing there, or even though it appears to be the case that there's nothing there. Field theory is the modality of theoretical discourse in physics which says, let's investigate the nothing that is there. Might be something there. Well, it turns out one of the things, what's there? Electromagnetism, right? You understand? So, okay. Field theory says, you know, I'm not going to let everything be determined by the simple empirical relation that I have as an observer to objects, right, which show up in a very specific and more or less straightforward way, given our conceptual assumptions, right? Field theory says there might be something there besides just these objects. There are forces at play, okay? So Duncan, I think, is primarily thinking along those lines, okay? But he also thinks about the field as a meadow, okay? But, you know, when if I bring Charlie Jenkins into the mix with Duncan, then all of a sudden, and Malcolm X for that matter, into the mix with Duncan, then field has another resonance too. They don't negate each other, they're all there together. And it's unclear that any one of them could be said to be there if the other 3 ain't there. At which point, it's actually unclear if any one of them is actually there. You understand? There's a field of energy at play, right? A translational force that's going on so that all those meanings are somehow present, but each of those meanings is disruptive of the other meanings, right? This volatility, right? It's, you know, this sort of semantic volatility, right? In which the words mean more than what they mean and also less than what they mean at the same time. It's an interesting problematic. Again, Professor Gordon is deeply interested in this problematic, because why? Why do we care about understanding? Why is understanding important? Understanding is important because understanding lets us get at the meaning of the experiences that Black folks have. Not just what happened, right? Not just the bare facts of life and death, not just the statistical, right? But why did it happen? Right? And why is a double edge, right? Not only what are the forces that produced the occurrence, but is there some purpose behind the occurrence? Can something be made out of what happened? Okay. What is made? What is unmade, right, in the face of this catastrophe, right? What is made in the face of the catastrophe, right? So meaning, and so you see what I'm trying to say. See, Dr. Gordon's like, we need to find the meaning, okay? And what I'm trying to suggest is, that's a difficult thing. it might be an impossible thing. Okay. That doesn't, please don't get it twisted. This is nothing like, I do not have the temerity to offer a critique of Edmund Gordon. Okay. It's a question for Dr. Gordon, right? Okay. Because developments in 20th century poetry, as well as developments in 20th century philosophy, let us know that the arrival, right, the achievement of an understanding of meaning is way, way, way more difficult than we had ever imagined. Okay. But it does not absolve us from the pursuit of it. Okay. Right. That's why there's a difference between the production of knowledge, where production implies achievement, arrival, right? And the pursuit of understanding, where pursuit implies we're after it, but we might not ever catch up to it, okay? And where pursuit also implies that prior understandings, which have been brutal and which have caused brutalization, those are things that we're on the run from, right? It's not just that we are pursuing understanding, we are fleeing from prior understandings that are brutal. Okay. This combination of flight from and pursuit of, that's what Nathaniel Mackey means by fugitivity. And I appreciate Dr. Dixon Roman trying to give me credit for it, but that's Nate Mackey, okay? i.e. Robert Duncan's student, Nate Mackey. But Nate Mackey was a student of a whole bunch of other people too, okay? So here's a sentence again. He prepares a field in the way that it can be said that a table is prepared. Y'all church folks will know what I mean, okay? In a way that neither cultivation nor protection captures, but to which improvision makes reminiscent, right? Looking back, okay? Reminiscent, okay? Experiential, experimental. And I'm interested precisely in this place where experience and experiment go together. Like as if we could get back to the roots of that word, which are common, those two words which are common. Experiential, experimental, and radically sensual, which is to say, empirical approach. So, again, remember I said before about approach. Approach is even more complicated than we imagine when what we are attempting to approach is what we are in. Okay? And again, the primary way that people have historically, epistemologically attempted to get at an approach of what we are in, for instance, to understand social life, here and now I'm talking about what might be called the social scientific attitude, right? Is to imagine a detachment from what you're in so that you can imagine some frame of reference or conceptual scheme from which you can look back at what you're in and say, oh, now I understand. Okay. And again, those kinds of understandings, those understandings that are predicated on detachment, right, and on conceptual scheme, are generally the kinds of understandings that we end up having to run from. There's a brutality that is held in that detachment, okay? Often the detachment, we want to think about it as morally, because it seems to be epistemologically neutral. Well, I have to separate myself from that object so that I can know it, okay? I got to separate myself from that object so that I can grasp it, okay? But grasp is a complicated word. It implies knowledge. It also implies ownership. Those people might not even be people, but to the minor extent to which they seem to be people, which is predicated on my empirical understanding of who they are and what they do, and I understand who they are and what they do because of how they operate under conditions which I have in fact created, right? Something wrong with them. They're suitable for being owned. And even if we relinquish ownership of them, they're still suitable for being controlled. Matter of fact, they have to be. Okay. You can relinquish ownership and still maintain containment. We know this, right? It's just an example, you see, of how it is that the traditional epistemological faculty of the understanding has been used, not just in philosophy, but in social science. You distance, and the distance is suitable so that grasp, part ownership, part knowing, right, can be accomplished. Okay. So you can see why, and often that this is complicated, okay? Professor Gordon is always trying to explain to us how it is that the production of knowledge and the pursuit of understanding are bound up with one another. Okay. But what he also opens up for us is the possibility of recognizing that this relationship between the production of knowledge and the pursuit of understanding might be problematic. It might, in fact, be toxic. Partly because it requires detachment, partly because you have to assume understanding, you have to assume the legitimacy of a conceptual framework that is separate from your object of knowledge, right? Okay. In order for that object of knowledge to even come into relief as something about which we might produce facts. Okay. This circularity, You produce an understanding of yourself as being capable of understanding, right? Okay. And then you produce images of others who are there to be understood, where the capacity for understanding is also the capacity for ownership, where the incapacity for understanding is also the susceptibility and even the legitimacy of being owned, right? Okay. What I'm getting at are the epistemological foundations of slavery and its ongoing existence. Okay. The resolutely abolitionist project that Dr. Gordon has been involved in for decades and decades and decades, okay, has a double edge to it. Can we enter into that project in ways that can turn it against the grain of brutality and in the direction of liberation? That's one side of it. Can our critical understanding of this modality lead us to the conclusion, and should it and ought it lead us to the conclusion, that there is in fact nothing redeemable about this epistemological framework? Okay. His work is constantly moving along both of those tracks. Okay. I don't think it's to be conceived of as a kind of ambivalence or wishy-washiness. To me, it's a function of care, right? Okay. And a function of devotion, right? It's really what one could think about it as. He's making a provision. He's making provision for us. Okay. I got to do both things, right? It's kind of like one of my heroes, General Baker, who was a figure in the great labor insurgency in Detroit under the rubric of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And he would say, he worked for Ford Motor Company, right? Why? Because that's where the workers were, and he was an organizer, and he needed to provide for his family. And every day he went to work for Ford Motor Company, and every day he worked as hard as he could to destroy Ford Motor Company. Okay? That's not ambivalence. That's the inhabitation of a contradiction, to heighten it and deepen it rather than to produce some artificial resolution of it. Okay? And again, seems to me is fundamental to Professor Gordon's work, right? An imminent critique of the philosophical foundations of social science, okay? And at the same time, a disruptive eruption into the foundations of social science that are meant in some ways to tear it down, okay? He does both these things, just like Joy and Pain, right? It's just like Frankie Beverly. That's why it's hard to write, you know? He's trying to get to something that he's in. Okay. What time is it?
3 o'clock.
It's 6 o'clock. So I see, okay. I'm going to read two paragraphs. And it's probably going to just repeat what I was already saying, but then it'll be time for us to talk, right, Yolanda? And then a whole lot of what I was going to say, it'll come up during the conversation. But I wrote something that I wanted to, what I really want to talk about is, when we start talking, is this amazing essay in Dr. Gordon's 3-volume conceptual memoir, The Pedagogical Imagination. It comes right at the end of, I think, the first volume, and it's an essay called My Heroines, Ordinary Black Women. And that's what I want. So can we can talk about that, okay? So, but I'm gonna read this. I see the sentence that I want to end. I didn't play any of my music. Oh well, it's okay. Let's see. I'll read this sentence again, the crazy one. He prepares a field in a way that it can be said that a table is prepared, in a way that neither cultivation nor protection captures, but to which improvision makes reminiscent, experiential, experimental, and radically sensual, which is to say empirical approach. Dr. Gordon is now perhaps something like what Nahum Chandler might call radical passage in the field. See, I was trying to talk about these passages that I'm constantly reading. And now I'm reading all these passages in Professor Gordon's work, but he's the passage too, right? He not only continually raises so that he can submerge himself in the questions concerning the epistemological foundations of the social sciences, he also asks those questions from the general and therefore unlocatable and therefore always more than universal apposition and displacement in which we are concerned with how to live and what to do. Dr. Gordon is, in this regard, essential to and exemplary of the Black radical tradition, and insofar as he is, he asks us along with him, he asks us to ask along with him what it is to be exemplary. This is given in the very terms with which he describes his magnum opus, The Pedagogical Imagination, whose 3 volumes he calls a conceptual memoir, therein echoing Dusk of Dawn, a work of his and our mentor, W.E.B. Du Bois, that was subtitled An Essay Toward an Autobiography of a Race Concept. This is to say that, like Du Bois, Dr. Gordon invites us to consider the interplay of the autobiographical and the conceptual so that, across a range of registers, we might think more deeply and more adventurously about the assumption of interiority and the force that assumption brings to bear on the ecology and cosmology of such social subsistence. You could, if you want to, call this a problem concerning heroism and intellectuality. And therein lies an echo of a prized and departed colleague, Jerry Garfield Watts, who raised this question some years ago regarding Ralph Ellison. This great book called Heroism and the Black Intellectual. But this is also a problem concerning liberation, right? What's this relay between autobiography, conceptuality, and liberation? and what might be the pitfalls in that relation. Okay? What does it mean that we have to keep producing heroes? And what do we lose in the production of heroes? Okay? Right? That's why the title of that essay is so deep to me. My heroines, who? Ordinary black women. Just right? There's some tension between the heroic and the ordinary that he's inviting us to consider, right? Okay. As I said, I've always been more of a DJ than a scholar. And while the mix redoubles exemplarity, it also disturbs it. So that even if the anthological arrangement of the music both echoes and establishes the very bouquet of the dance floor. Okay, so anthology, it's my favorite word. And it's a bunch of flowers. That's the etymological root of it. See? So when I say bouquet, I'm thinking that, but when I say bouquet, I'm also thinking aroma, sweat, funk, okay? It establishes the very bouquet of the dance floor, constantly bringing on the juice of the social situation like a funky drummer. See, I keep thinking ain't nobody else know what I'm, anyway. And then I say whatever, it doesn't matter, okay? But it's entirely unclear if DJs saved lives. Is the life that is spent in the example's individuation something that can be passed on, if not revived, in Fade's resistance? We have to test it out. And that's why I wanted to share all those passages, which maybe I'll come back again and share them another time. These passages, and there was passage from a great poet named Martin Carter, in addition to the Duncan. There's a couple passages from Immanuel Kant, this brilliant, amazing passage from Du Bois, Hortense Spillers, Andaya. We can talk about these. I wanted to share those with you, but I just didn't have time. But because of those passages and the way they fold and fade into one another and through one another, and through the very idea of one another, so that it's unclear if they were separate passages from a bunch of separate authors, but part of some general book of life that we're in, right? In addition to that, we're also reading, okay? That's the meadow that I'm often permitted to return to and turn and fade into that enfolding and that unfolding of the field with gratitude now to and for Dr. Gordon. So that this talk, weak as it is not so much about giving him his flowers as it is about reveling in the flowers that he has given to us. So, all right, thank you.
Thank you.
It is the first time, indeed, that I've cried at an academic talk. And I will do my best to compose myself as I thank you for your genius, as I thank you for your love of Black people and Black women in particular. I thank the Edmund Gordon Center, specifically Dr. Ezekiel Dixon Roman, for inviting me. I thank my mother for teaching me to say yes to challenges that sometimes scare me. And I thank the organizers of this event for putting Chris Emden as the closing comments. Because as you talked about science and you made reference to physics and science, he is a brother that lights up the field of science. And in so many ways, the way that you engaged with us, your invitation into your linguistic field of flowers is often what Dr. Emden does. And I thank all of you for being here. And my questions honestly don't matter. I'm going to be honest about that. I will share with you that one of the first questions I had, and I used the word cultivate, I was going to ask you who cultivates your genius, but you so generously showed us who improvises your genius throughout your talk, and I thank you for that. I would like for you to actually, if I can just share a few notes and then have us return to some of the points that you did not get to. What is sticking with me very deeply is this idea of passages and people as passages and the gathering of people and voices and what we might learn, right, in these snippets or paragraphs of passages. I'm trying to sit with that. Also, what came to mind, last night a DJ saved my life. And if you are the DJ, I'm in good shape.
Well, there's not a problem that I can't fix.
Oh, come on,
because I can do
right?
it in the mix.
About to come up with a soundtrack. I was sitting there talking to my dear friend, Dr. Sonia Cherry-Paul, and paying attention to my body. The chills in my body, my hands being sweaty, feeling like I wanted to cry, being moved to tears. Taking erratic notes, which probably make more sense later after I've meditated on them. And I think what I want to do is just share what stood out for me and then literally just invite you to continue what you have opened up so generously for us. I do want to thank Dr. Gordon for his life and his life's work. And this is the 10th anniversary of commemoration of a life well lived. And one of the questions I did have for you is, as we are engaging in Dr. Gordon's legacy through this talk, is do you think about your own legacy at times? And what do you believe? This is an actual question, if you feel like answering it at some point. What do you believe people or folks will say that they learned from you that they want to carry forward? So I just wanted you to think about that in your own legacy. I was thinking about this idea of, Frankie Beverly, Joy and Pain. That was one of the first concerts that was my first date. No, my first date was Wild Style, the movie Wild, okay. All right, I'm sorry. It's a hip hop movie, y'all, all right? My second date was Frankie Beverly and Maze. And when you talk about 100% joy, 100% pain, this notion of being outside of the calculable is where perhaps we can begin to pursue understanding of life. And this is something I will meditate on a very, very long time. I will also meditate on this idea, and I wrote this before you were talking about improvisation, and I said, feeling that you are sharing with us, when you're talking about your journey, I'm feeling that you are sharing with us your journey to the beyond. And I imagine that improvisation might be baby steps for us nascent travelers to begin. So I want to thank you for that invitation of me thinking about my own journey of life as improvisation. I think the more that I engage in meditation and prayer, the more I understand the possibility of improvisation in terms of building a life that I desire for myself and for my daughter and my mother, who is still with me. And those are just my notes on trying to make sense of all that you gave tonight.
Well, there's so much, thank you, first of all. There's so much richness in all you said, and every phrase would kind of displace one bag of treasure for another. But I'm thinking now of the trio, the trios that I have been in. Okay, so.
Would you like some water?
Oh, I got some.
Okay.
I'm good. But
can I open it is the question. I'll
but
try another bottle.
This, I don't know if any of y'all are. I'm sure some of y'all are. Yeah, I got it. Some of y'all must be familiar with the work of LaToya Ruby Frazier. It's extraordinary photographer who was born and raised in Braddock, Pennsylvania, which is an old steel town outside of Pittsburgh. And I'm trying to think of the name of her book, the first book, The Notion of Family, which is really about this deep, 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 intense relation between her and her mother and her grandmother. So I'm thinking of you and your daughter and your mother. And I'm thinking of this intense relationship between me and my mom and my grandma. And in the trio shift, we added my partner, Laura, when my mom passed, and then it was me and Laura and my grandmother, you know. This sort of on the ground kind of Trinitarian thing is something that I'm really deeply invested in, and it's obviously not anything like a normative family romance. It's complicated, but so much of everything that I'm doing, you know, is a function of my grandmother was an orphan. She went to live with her uncle, who was a mean, brilliant little Garveyite in Kingsland, Arkansas, who was mad.
Had reason to be.
And took it out on his niece and nephew who came to live with him. But what saved my grandmother was his wife, whose name was Berta Mott, spelled Birdia, which is the same as my mom's name. And Berta Mott, you know, died in 1950. But I can see her through stories, through, we call her Big Mom Berta, right? My grandmother should have been a poet and an English professor. She loved Keats. She used to wake me up in the morning reciting that Paul Laurence Dunbar poem, In the Morning. Liars, bless the Lord. Don't you know the days abroad? You know, I mean, and she would, but she cleaned up this white woman's house, Susie Campbell, for 30 years, okay, who was, as my grandmother would put it, rebbish. I don't know if y'all know, as an Arkansas, you can figure out what it means, okay. And then when she could, she picked cotton to send my mom to school, Arkansas A&M, which is now University of Arkansas Pine Bluff. That's where my mom went to college. My mom was a sociology major. It's just a long-winded approach to, see, I grew up, you know, an only child of my mom, you know. My parents were divorced when I was young.
Can I say, my daughter is a sociology major. I'm divorced. My daughter's an only child. What is happening here? The ancestors are at work, it seems.
And sociology it was sacred to my mom. Now my grandmother, it's complicated, right? My grandmother, I remember my mom came home from Pine Bluff and it was too big, and you know, Kingsland, Arkansas had 300 people in it. And she didn't want to go back after Christmas. And they told a story, my grandmother didn't even listen. She just kept packing the suitcase. She didn't even listen to her. Which is to say, My mother got sent to school. She didn't go to college. She got sent. I got sent. Okay? So the people who, my mom gravitated to sociology. I grew up in a house, when I was 8, 9, 10 years old, I knew who Gunnar Myrdal was. I knew who Hortense Powdermaker was, Horace Mann Bond, John Dollard. These were sacred. I think the worst day of my mom's life was when her books got burned up in a fire, right? And it was all those, Negro education in Alabama. This stuff. My mom, she wanted to go. She had a fellowship to go to the University of Illinois and study, but for some reason that was too far for my grandma. So my mom ended up teaching school in this little town called Monticello, Arkansas. And eventually she moved to Las Vegas where I was born, and she took great pride in being a teacher. She called herself an educator, okay? And that's why, I'm an only child, but my mom has certain students who became like my siblings. So my sister, Glenda White, is on YouTube watching it, because Glenda emailed me. She never ever had any interest, I'm not saying that. What I mean is she never talked to me about looking at me on YouTube or anything.
She's on there
but
right
she was
now.
like, she's on there now.
You want to say hi to Glenda?
Hey, Glenda. Hey, Miss White. But my mother used to just call her White, anyway, but Glenda's from, anyway, but Glenda, I think she must have seen, there's some announcement I was making at teachers, so she knew that she's like, what would BF said,
Wow.
Giving it. So that sociological impulse is deep, with my mom, and it was a fundamental element of what and so when I had a chance to start really trying to study Professor Gordon's work, it was so reminiscent of these conversations that I had with my mom, because he talks about stuff, so they share a common language. I think they're roughly, he's probably a little bit older than what she was. She was born in 1934. But to be immersed in that language again was so deep, and it's how come I couldn't get anything finished, because it was like going back through. So it wasn't so much that I'm thinking so much about my legacy as much as I'm sitting here sort of as my mother's and my grandmother's and my grandfather's, and my father too, who couldn't read, but who was deeply concerned about my education, and so all of that stuff is there. But I'm concentrating on the women for this reason, because of that essay of Professor Gordon's, and it gets back to that problem of the incalculable. So I have two friends, one of whom I'm still really close friends with, and the other who we fell out for some stupid reason that I don't even know, but I've been thinking about him a lot over the last 2 weeks, and I hope someday y'all have both of them come and have the honor of doing this lecture.
Might be time to call them.
So their names are R.A. Judy and Nahum Chandler. And Nahum and R.A., I like to believe, jointly discovered this extraordinary essay by Du Bois that he wrote in 1905 called Sociology Hesitant. Okay, so in standard intellectual history, 1905 is referred to as the Annus Mirabilis, the miracle year. But it's the miracle year of Albert Einstein. It's basically the year in which he published these 4 papers that basically, I don't want to say closed the door, but sort of showed us the limits of Newtonian physics and showed us the pathway toward quantum mechanics. And he's the bridge that stands between those two or the field, if you will, that stands, the force that stands between these two very different ways of understanding the world. One is a deterministic way of understanding the world that's kind of predicated on the simple, straightforward opposition between subjects who know and objects that are known. Okay, and of course we know that Kant's, the greatest, the most fundamental modern philosopher, his philosophies of politics, of the subject, of education, of thinking, of anthropology, were based on Newtonian mechanics. So Einstein is sort of saying, well, it turns out that we just can't be sure about subjects and objects. Subjects and objects seem to move, and when they move, our knowledge of them is transformed, right? That we are, there's an old kind of Catholic way of saying that we are in action in the world, okay? And insofar as we are in action in the world, we can't have a stance towards the world that presupposes a kind of inaction from which we then can know. The stuff that we're trying to know is moving, and we're moving too, and we're in what we're trying to know, okay? So it turns out it takes about 25 years for physicists to really understand the implications of what Einstein does in 1905 with these 4 essays. And here you get Du Bois in 1905, and it is as if he understood the implications of Einstein, because it is as if he's not only producing a set of insights with regard to knowledge, but he's also giving us a kind of weird, he's actually producing for us an understanding of the meaning of those insights. One way to think about what Einstein's doing is, it's a critique of positivism, right? There's a beautiful critique of positivism, by the way, that's in Professor Gordon's essay, right? Okay. And an understanding of the historical importance of positivism and how it plays itself out in our intellectual history. Einstein is basically like, yeah, he still sort of has a foot in the deterministic world. He never really gives it up, right? He doesn't like the idea that God plays dice with the universe, which is his famous formulation. And he didn't even really believe in God, right? But he believed in a kind of position that something like a God might take that would make knowledge possible in a deterministic way. What Du Bois is saying in 1905 is, well, there are 2 rhythms of human social action. One is the evident rhythm. You see it in the birth rate and the death rate. Right. You see it's statistical, right? And he says, there's another, what he calls incalculable rhythm of human action. He says, you know where you see that? The activity of a woman's club. Right?
I know there's somewhere out someone with a sign saying something about time. Oh, we still have time? Oh, this is a beautiful thing. Please continue, because I'm reading also Chris Emden's Body over there when you're talking about Einstein and you're talking about the incalculable. Please continue, because I also have these other, and talk about notes. You're creating these notes in my mind of things that I want to talk about with your mother in sociology, and the sociology I see in your poetry. Well, and I want to invite you to read a poem. So that was my segue into have a poem ready.
See, I'm going to try to wrap it up, because I'm taking all your time, because I didn't finish the stupid thing anyway.
Time is elusive.
But he's saying, yeah, it's the activity of a woman's club. Now, who might he have meant? Maybe Mary Church Terrell, but I like to believe that even if he didn't know he meant them, he also meant, my grandmother and her best friend, Miss Mattie, when they would be sitting on the porch shelling peas, right?
Maybe my grandma could be in that club too, Rebecca Walton.
Okay. Or a quilting circle, like the Women of Gee's Bend, Alabama. And the music, one of the pieces I was going to play was there's this extraordinary band called Night Beauty but it's spelled Nitebjuti. It's a trio of Caribbean sort of experimental electronic musicians that get the term night beauty from an old Haitian folktale about a beautiful woman who was desired by the son of a king, and it's kind of a Cinderella story, whose brother was jealous of her and then killed her. And
Sounds like stuff we hear every day.
buried her in a field.
Ah.
And then 3 years later, a bone pops up out of a hole and starts to sing. Okay? And that's these musicians' metaphor in a way, right? For a range of things, but black, So that also is a woman's club, okay? So I was educated at meetings of the Women's Club, okay? My mom and Alice Key and Gwen Weeks, they would bring me over to the house on New Year's Day when they would sit and listen to jazz, and they taught me how to listen to music.
Can I ask you something about art? Because I once heard you say, not too long ago, that you no longer believed in art and the artist. And I think a lot about James Baldwin and what he talked about in terms of the moral responsibility of the artist really is to illuminate in these dark times, these times of war and anti-blackness and ecological destruction, like really, literally, we're destroying Mother Earth. And Amy Cesar and so many who talked about the responsibility of the artist. And I wanted to ask you personally, do you still feel that way? And what led you to that moment? Because as I listen to you so effortlessly weave in from Aretha Franklin, to Frankie Beverly, to Miles Davis, to Coltrane, these prominent, iconic artists who have been the soundtrack, literally, of our lives. So can you talk about that moment in time, if you remember, why you felt that way, and do you feel that way now?
Well, I no longer believe in art, but I still love it. I mean, my relation to art now is kind of like my relation to pork.
No pork on my fork?
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's probably bad for us, but I ain't gonna stop eating it, so.
I get it.
It's, part of it, well, so the other sort of big trio I'm in, I guess, these days is with my partner, Laura, and Stefano Harney, who I write about with, and we work together on things, but Laura, after our kids were born, she was finishing her dissertation, under extreme conditions, and I'll never forget, I don't even remember what year it was. It probably was 2010 or 2009, maybe. But she uttered this phrase that changed the way I think about stuff. And the phrase is the aesthetic sociality of blackness. And so it's not this horrifically tragic thing that I no longer believe in art, because I absolutely believe in the aesthetic sociality of blackness. Now, and I've been trying to understand what that is, or how it works, or how to, and obviously you understand it from within it. And this is the thing, is that what's deep is, see, like, the figure of the artist is not unlike the figure of the social scientist, which is to say that there's a temptation that is often there, that when you deal with the difficulty of this admixture of joy and pain, when you deal with the difficulty of trying to understand or to know or to understand what it is that you're in, right? I don't mean to be denigrating when I say this, but the easy way out is to say, well, I need to get out of this so I can see it. Okay. One even thinks about it in terms of like the brilliant, beautiful opening of Mules and Men, Zora Neale Hurston. Well, when I was down, I was glad when they told me I could go study Negro folklore, come up here to Columbia University, just because when I was down there in Eatonville, I was in it, but it fit me like a tight chemise, right? I needed some distance from it in order to understand it. And again, this is a problematic that emerges for us who have been sent. I got sent to Harvard. Why? To study the place and the people that sent me. You know, one way to put it is the way the great Guyanese thinker Andaya, who's one of the passages I want to read, she talks about this with regard to the character of Mr. Slime in George Lamming's great novel, In the Castle of My Skin. Mr. Slime being the prototypical figure of the post-colonial leader who betrays his people. She says, why is it that these people who we nurture and sacrifice into power, why is it that they become the ones who give aid and comfort to our enemies? That's a deep question. And then you got to think about it for a minute, because it's like, yeah, we nurture these people and we sacrifice for them to go into power, but it also means we nurture them and we sacrifice them to power. I heard Ruby say, let's talk about this. Why do we send our kids to school, to places where they will not be loved, where they will be hated? Now, and we send them with a double mission, which might not be compatible. My mom sent me to school for two reasons. One, so I could make a living and not have to struggle. She was a teacher, and then she became a public administrator, but you know, we had it was tough, you know. She would sell sweet potato pies, and I mean, she did all kind of stuff, but she was basically like, okay, boy, I'm sending you to school so you can make a living. And then she would put on little Donny Hathaway singing Little Ghetto Boy and say, that's you, right? You know, that's an exhortation, right? That song is amazing, right? He's like, here, little ghetto boy, you have come up under utterly impossible conditions, right? There is no way, really, there's really technically no way that you could do for us what I'm getting ready to tell you that it is in fact your responsibility to do.
But if I may say, Dr. Moten, what my introduction to your work, and it is through the undercommons, and that enormous work that you've done with Stefano Harvey, is that yes, you were sent to a place like Harvard, you were sent to this place to study, but you have flipped the word study on its head. You have redefined in some ways, and having us see that study does not happen only in the university. That in fact, it happens in all other spaces that we should be paying attention to. So is there any, and I'm not trying to force this, but reconciliation, if you will, that yes, your mother sent you off to study, and you have redefined study, and you have invited a generation to redefine what study and the university can be?
Well, I got sent to study where I came from. and I came with the help of my friends. We all together, you know, Stefano and Laura, but all the other people, you know, Saidia Hartman, Nahum, Judy, all of these, you know, so many people I can't even. Well, you know.
True story. Saidia Hartman and my daughter went to dance school together. I mean, I'm having so many moments up here, and I'm trying to pretend to stay quiet, but the connections are amazing and just electrifying to me. I just want to just thank you for that.
We all came from somewhere, you know, and so, you know, I would say, look, I mean, I think that if there's any utility to trying to recalibrate our understanding of study, it comes along at a moment when, you know, historically the idea that study was something that you could only do in the university, well, if we attempt to turn that idea on its head, hopefully it's in time, because the fact of the matter is that the university as a place of study is implausible, if not impossible, and it's getting shut down with greater intensity every day.
Right.
I was reading this thing, we were reading this thing the other night last night about, you know, they're getting rid of the study of languages in the University of West Virginia. Y'all seen that stuff. So we see it everywhere. So it's good to realize that the university isn't the only place where study can happen, because pretty soon university is going to be the last place you would even think to go to in order to be able to study.
That's why I took away my question, is the university redeemable in any way? So I decided not to answer that, because the more that I read in the Undercommons, I understand that it isn't. And I'm looking at the time, and I want to just, there's so much I want to say, but I want to say that I recently heard you speak about joy, and that the way to, and this was a joyful experience for me. So I just want to say, again, thank you, Dr. Ezekiel Dixon-Rahman. And you said the way to preserve joy is to practice it. And I want to thank you for this joyful evening, this moment. I want to thank you for the joy in the practice of your poetry. And I'm grateful that you're about to read something. And what I wanted to share as I am going deeper into your poems, and you mentioned your mother being a sociologist, and the lens, and I see so much of sociology in your poetry and in the way that you invite us into the study of what can be in our world and the study of what we can be as humans. So with that, I want to thank you and just have the audience listen to some of the beauty of Dr. Moten's poetry.
So, thank you again, and I feel like, well, we just gotta keep talking. But my like my trio, you know, me and my grandmother and my mom. One time, I think I must have been in college, but we met up in Arkansas for Christmas. And we decided to take a little side trip and drive up the Mississippi Delta on Highway 61. My grandmother, even though she lives about 50 miles from the Mississippi border, had never been to Mississippi. Wow. So this poem is called B. Jenkins, and it's from the book called B. Jenkins, and B was what everybody called my mom. And this is something that I think I started working on when we were on that trip driving up Highway 61. B. Jenkins. Her territory sunflower, insurgent floor time in real time in the Field Museum. Bertha Lee and her lyric ways in her urban plan. Up and down the regular highway, and every two-tone station, passing through to cure, for preservation to unfold it all away. She put the new thing in the open cell one more time about the theory of who we are. In the names away in blocks with double names to interrupt and gather, kept dancing in tight circles between break and secret, vaulted with records in our basement, where the long-haired hippies and Afro-blacks all get together across the tracks and they party. Everybody sewn like grain and touched in stride. Now the cold new reckoning is tired, and you've been waiting for a preferential song. The multiplex should be in the frame like bodies in a house way back in the woods, fled in suspended projects like the real thing, posed for the midnight trill. Essential shtetl of the world stage, born way before you was born. Move the administered word by breathing to hand beautiful edge around.
Thank you, Dr. Fred Moulton. I'm inviting my brother, Christopher Emden, I believe, to the stage. And I'm going to take a moment to pause. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. No, I think I'm going to move so that Chris can sit. No, I'll move so you can sit. Yes. Oh, you can sit. No, whatever you want to do. I think it's just your recap.
I don't know. I think we're supposed to do some questions, and I don't know if that's going to happen or not. So I just want to start by saying, I was a bad man, bro. Brad, just thank you for your genius, and so much emerged out of the conversation. And I'm just going to try. This is a very concluding remarks in like 5 minutes. It's crazy for what we received. You know, I'm gonna tell a quick story. So when I was in I grew up in the Bronx and went to college in the Bronx. You already know. And my first time away from home, I went to grad school in Troy, New York. I went to RPI, and it was a master's program in the natural sciences. And so when we all came in as a cohort, and so when the whole cohort came in, it was wild because I looked around, I was like, man, I'm the only black person in this cohort. And so everybody sat down and everybody shared, where they came from and what brought them to this program. So it all folks went around the room, and it was my turn, and I said, I'm Chris, and I'm from the Bronx. And there was like a gasp in the room. And there were no words said, but the gasp said everything. And other folks introduced themselves, but everything fell flat after my revelation. I remember after the meeting, I just felt like this one gonna work in this program. And then something really interesting happened. This little white girl named Jill came up to me as I was walking towards the quad. She goes, Chris. I said, yeah. And she goes, are you really from the Bronx? And I said, yes. And I looked at her and she had these wide eyes that didn't say what the gasp did, but said a very different feeling. And she goes, well, tell me about it. I was like, well, damn. I asked you to tell me where you're from. And she asked some other questions, and I kind of skirted the questions. And then she asked me, have you ever been shot at? But it was weird because she asked if I was being shot at, but it wasn't in like a, you gangster, have you been shot at? It was really like, it was the other side of the gasp. It was like curiosity, not harm. But the statement was harmful, but her eyes was not the gasp. So I said no. And then she asked me, can we be friends? So I said, fine, we can be friends, Jill. And so our relationship developed after that. And as our relationship sort of revealed itself, she asked me what I was into, and I said hip hop, and I wanted to be a DJ. This is how the story came to me. And I love to dance. And then she said, Chris, you wouldn't believe this, but I'm a hip hop dancer. And I was like, Jill? And she was like, I'm a hip hop dancer, and I didn't want to tell you the first 3 weeks we've known each other, but this is who I am. And I think that we should go somewhere where we can hip hop dance. And so I was like, all right, Jill, well, the closest place I know is a club in Albany. It's a hip hop club in Albany. And she goes, I know exactly what you're talking about. Saturday, I'm driving. So now it's the next step of the event. Right? So we get to the club, and now everything's reversed, right? Because I was the only black dude in the court. Now Jill, the only white person in the club. And somehow in me, it gave me some comfort in knowing she would maybe somehow feel the gasp that she overlooked. But she didn't. And then a track came on. I don't remember what the track was, but the track came on. We at the bar, and she goes, Chris, this is my song. So I'm like, I've heard my song too. What you want me to do, Jill? And she goes, you've got to clear the dance floor. Damn. But she looked at me with the same eyes of curiosity about whether or not I'd been shot, so I knew there was some innocence in the ask. So I said, oh well, fuck it. And I went and I cleared the dance floor. And then my homegirl walks in, she gets to the middle of the space, everybody's looking, and she decides to demonstrate her dance. And as she does so, she goes in 5, 4, 3, 2, and step. And she had worked out a choreographed hip-hop dance that she was convinced in her mind and heart made her credible enough to be a hip-hop dancer.
Wow. Wow.
And so as I sat, because I ain't standing there, and witnessed the phenomenon, I came, without knowing what it was, to understand the incalculable.
Wow.
She didn't understand that in that space and in that moment, what we did and what we do is just be. She'd been convinced that there was steps and process, input and output, evidence and outcome that allowed her to have the credibility to be the thing that we get by just being. Your talk was the being, the flow. And cats have ways to describe it, right? Psychologists call it flow. Black churches call it the Holy Ghost. MCs call it the freestyle. It's a real freestyle. But it is inevitably the incalculable. The essence of your work, your spirit, what you did for us today, what you pulled from Dr. Gordon to present and offer to us is just that magic. And I want you to understand the magic of Dr. Moten and the magic of the incalculable. There's one concept that as you spoke I thought of, and as a science read, is this concept of escape velocity. Everybody say escape.
Escape
Velocity.
velocity.
The phrase in itself is oxymoronic, right? Because velocity operates in space and time and moving in a particular direction. Escape is like, yo, you just let go, like I'm escaping from a thing. And what's wild about escape velocity is it's the speed that an object needs to be traveling from an existing body for it to be able to escape the forces of gravity. The point from which you're going in ordered steps, and then you let go and the divine takes over. And I think that what we all at TC aspire to, particularly those of us that are interested in teacher education and that craft, is how the hell do you train somebody to engage at escape velocity when all they've been trained for is velocity in a Cartesian, Newtonian, Baconian dimension in which you describe like the anti-positives, this movement in a different direction that Einstein's bad wasn't that he came up with something that was gangster. Einstein, it wasn't just the thing he came up with, it's the fact that he came up with something that nobody knew what it was.
Right.
It was the fact that he was able to try to articulate a concept that you couldn't calculate, and he let them cats who was always operating in one dimension try to figure it out.
Right.
The bag is, how do we quantify the essence of blackness that can never be calculated? That's what Dr. Moten offers us, right? A pathway to possibility in an impossible circumstance, operating with velocity and concurrently at escape. The tensions in it, and the concurrent freedom in it. The knowing that you can try all you want to be a hip-hop dancer, but you ain't got the flow. This talk, this moment, the spirit that graces us with his brilliance. I couldn't take notes fast enough. My fingers couldn't catch up to my brain. And my heart didn't know what to do with itself. And my concluding remarks are just that. One day, maybe, we can all humble ourselves enough within institutions with structures and rules and boundaries and norms and rubrics and benchmarks to reach as high as the incomparable. Thank you. We gotta be out of here in 4 minutes. And Veronica said I gotta make sure y'all ask questions. Right, Veronica?
There's one there.
And so we'll just take 2 really quickly before we close.
It's a mic, just hold it a little closer.
Okay, oh, I don't know how to do this. First, I want to say thank you so much for giving this and giving this in this space. That's the first thing I want to say. It was brilliant, it was gorgeous, and it was amazing. My second thing I want to say is, as far as research goes, so I'm just curious because I am also someone studying speech therapy, and I'm doing research on Black English and how that is a part of the Black experience, and that's something that we tend to not talk about as much. And I just wanted to say, as far as your time and as far as the Black experience goes, so how has you found it over time as far as things like opportunity and us using Black English and us freely using it? And is it more okay today to use it? That's just my question, sorry.
No, that's a really, really excellent question. Thank you. You know, it's funny because I think it's like a double edge, you know? I remember when I was a kid, this comedy record came out, and I loved it. It had all these sort of parodic versions of sort of Black, you know, popular singers at the time, like James Brown and Joe Tex, and it kind of seemed to be reveling in the richness and in the sort of generativity of Black English. I don't remember the name of the album, but the artist was Bill Cosby. And I remember thinking years later, as he would go off on his screeds and tirades against Black English, what's this about? I loved Fat Albert. I loved the way in which it, again, kind of lovingly reveled, not just in Black English, but in the varieties of Black English. Mm-hmm. In the varieties of Black English, it could even come from the same neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like it's so rich and so complicated and so internally differentiated. And why is it that he was so adamantly opposed to it, not just as an object of study, but as a modality of study? But my sense of it is that he's not that deep or unusual. He spoke for and from a normative position. And the normative position is a simple position, right? And it's a simple position, but it's driven by complex desires. One is the desire to regulate and repress and eradicate, and the other is the desire to enjoy, right? And Black English still remains, as it were, sort of, held within that dialectic, is that the very people who want to eradicate it and dishonor it are also the ones who want to enjoy it. And this is a position of danger, but it also strangely is a condition of preservation, right? Now, at a certain point, we who love it, outside of that ambivalence, have to come up with some ways to preserve it outside of that brutal dialectic. And I think, there's obviously a lot of people who are engaged in that, but for folks who do the kind of work that you do, it's especially important, that Black English not be understood to be a speech pathology.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing research on, because
Right.
there's a lot of children being diagnosed with disorders they don't have.
Yeah.
That's what I'm doing research on. So there's a lot of children getting misdiagnosed with disorders that they do not have because they speak African American vernacular, and that's a problem. We shouldn't be putting a whole bunch of kids in special ed that don't need to be there. That's crazy. So that's what happens within the system.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've been thinking about the distinction you were talking about between improvision and improvisation. And I'm writing an essay for one of my classes about the album Charles Mingus Presents Charles Mingus. And I'm thinking about the way that I had to learn that was a studio album and it wasn't a live album. And I'm also thinking about the way it's super tightly arranged and the way that arrangement probably took form in my head, is I'm imagining like Mingus kind of looks over at Danny Richmond, the drummer, and Danny Richmond kind of looks over at Charles Mingus, and one of them nods, and that's how they know that they're about to go to the next section or time signature or whatever. And I'm thinking about, and so my question is kind of like, what do we call that moment that is neither improvisation, because it's not exactly pre-planned, but it's not improvisation, because it's not exactly spontaneous, or doing something that neither of them have never thought about before. And I'm also thinking about that in terms of like Wadada Leo Smith's compositional practice, where oftentimes he'll create a chart, or at least when he came to my school, like 6 or 7 years ago, he brought charts that were almost minimalist, but then he didn't transpose those charts. And so each instrument, when they arrived at each different section of the composition, was playing something simultaneously expected and unexpected.
Yeah. No, man, that's great. It's like, it's a totally deep question. And I actually have like a one-word answer, which obviously I will expand upon, but practice. That's how you describe it, right? Which is to say, and again, I remember when I first started writing, like my first book, I loved jazz, so much. And I was mad, at this notion that it wasn't an intellectual activity, or that it wasn't, and I realized it wasn't that it was fine to be mad. You can be mad, but you can't let the thing that you're mad at actually determine how you think about something, right? And I realized it's like, it didn't need to be understood by way of the units of measure and the conceptual apparatuses that denigrated it, So it's like, okay, yeah, they're not looking ahead because they're looking back. And that's where the practice comes in, right? So Mingus eventually, a couple years, maybe 4 or 5 years after, so that album, that's 1960, right? I think there's this amazing, crazy record that didn't come out until after his passing, but it was a concert that he recorded at UCLA in 1960, I believe it was 66. And by that time, he had started calling his band the Charles Mingus Jazz Workshop. And workshop is key, because they were working on shit. They were working on it, right? They were working on stuff. I think, and at one point, the band starts messing up a chart, and he shuts down the thing, and they go off stage during a concert for 30 minutes to practice, and then come back. Right, because he's like, actually, I remember, I got a friend, a great bass player named Brandon Lopez. We played music together sometimes. And he was over to the house the other day. Laura was there. And he said, the best thing you can do for the audience is not give a fuck about them. Right? It's that, because we're working on something here, And the audience is working on something too. We're all working on something here. We're trying to get something. I don't want to say we're trying to get something. We're working on something. And tomorrow we're going to be working on it again. Right? And that's, and part of how we work on it is we pay attention to what we did yesterday. We think through that again. We go over it again. And this is what I think you hear what you hear in Charles Mingus Presents Charles Mingus is a band that's about to break up. Right? Because Eric Dolphy was getting ready to leave. So, Nat Hentoff in the liner notes, he interprets this beautiful sort of duet thing that they do on this song called What Love as an argument, as a breakup argument, right? He says, but really, that's one way to look at it, but another way to look at it is that they had been working together until it was time for them to go work on something else. But they had gotten to a point, right? And I think the music is replete with these instances in which you get to a point where the distinction between improvisation and determinate organization just breaks down. Because you feel, you don't, it's like this great novelist, Julio Cortázar, wrote this book called Hopscotch about a jazz musician. He's Argentinian. There's one moment in the book where the musician is playing something. He goes, damn, I played that tomorrow. Right? It's like, so normal spatiotemporal constituency is gone. Right. We're in something different now. So,
I'm sorry. We gotta go.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haley. And we also have a round of applause for Dr. Stephen Lee.
Thank you. Chris, you need some water, honey? Oh.
Because there's a misperception that thing